Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Bill Benson. I am the host of the museum's public program, First Person. Thank you for joining us today. We are in our 17th year of the First Person program, and our first person today is Mr. Henry Kahn, whom we shall meet shortly. This 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation. We are grateful for their sponsorship, and I'd like to acknowledge that Mr. Lewis Smith is with us right here in the front row. First Person is a series of conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who share with us their firsthand accounts of their experience during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as volunteers here at this museum. Our program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website, which is at www.ushmm.org, provides information about each of our upcoming first-person guests, and the program you received today has the museum's web address on that as well. Anyone interested in keeping in touch with the museum and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card that you'll find in your program, or speak with a museum representative at the back of the theater. In doing so, you will receive an electronic copy of Henry Kahn's biography so that you can remember and share his testimony after you leave here today. Henry will share with us his first-person account of his experience during the Holocaust and as a survivor for about 45 minutes. If we have time toward the end of our program for you to ask some questions, we'll do that. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend the decades. What you are about to hear from Henry is one individual's account of the Holocaust. We've prepared a brief slide presentation to help with his introduction. Henry Kahn was born Heinz Kahn on January 18, 1923, in Böblingen, Germany. This photo shows Henry in 1946, prior to his induction in the United States Army. The arrow on this map points to the town of Böblingen, where Henry was born. Here we see Henry's mother Hedwig and his father Adolf, who was a cattle dealer and fought for Germany in World War I. Later, Henry's father became president of a cattle dealers association. On November 9th through 10th, 1938, the Nazis unleashed a violent series of attacks on Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues throughout Germany, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Henry's father was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp. This photograph shows Germans passing the broken window of a Jewish-owned business that was destroyed during Kristallnacht. Henry's father returned home a month later. Shortly after this, Henry left Germany through a Kindertransport, a rescue effort that brought thousands of Jewish children to Great Britain from Nazi Germany between 1938 and 1939. Henry arrived in England in February 1939. When World War II began, September 1st, 1939, British authorities required Henry to register as an enemy alien. He was sent by ship to Australia, which is highlighted in red on this map of the world. After just one night in an internment camp there, Henry and 12 other men were selected to return to England, only to end up in Bombay, India. The arrow on this map points to India. In 1946, Henry moved to the United States. After the war, Henry learned Nazi authorities had deported his parents to the Lodz Ghetto in 1941. They were later murdered. We close with this photograph of Henry and Doreen Raymond on their wedding day in 1948. He met Doreen in Bombay in 1943. Just a few months after Henry's arrival in New York in 1946, he was drafted into the United States Army. With the end of the draft, he was honorably discharged in the spring of 1947. Henry's sweetheart from Bombay, Doreen, arrived in the U.S. on June 9, 1948. They were married 18 days later on June 27, 1948. After working in the export-import business, Henry went into the scrap metal business. While working full-time and raising a family, he enrolled in Baruch College at the City University of New York as an evening student in 1956, earning his degree in industrial management in 1966. Doreen attended Queens College, getting a degree as a paralegal, and worked as a paralegal in the Empire State Building. Henry remained in the scrap metal business until his 65th birthday in 1988. He then became a real estate agent. Following a diagnosis of lung cancer in 1992, Henry retired from his real estate work. Henry and Doreen raised two sons, Ralph Ansel and Roy David. Their sons gave them two grandsons and a granddaughter. To be closer to their family, Henry and Doreen moved from New York to Bethesda, Maryland in 2000. Doreen passed away in November 2012. Henry said to me, "We were very much in love right up to the end." Henry continues to volunteer at the Montgomery County Thrift Shop, where Doreen and he contributed their time together. Following the loss of Doreen, Henry became involved with this museum as a volunteer. Henry speaks to small groups at the museum. He also speaks about his Holocaust experience at local high schools and colleges. Henry is fluent in English and German. He walks regularly and said he is now increasing his exercise. He also reads a lot and spends time with family and friends. And I'm pleased to say that Henry today is joined by both sons, Ralph and Roy, and their wives, Lena and Judy. Their grandson and granddaughter, grandson Sasha and granddaughter Alina, are both with us. And I believe that Sasha just graduated from high school this past week. And with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first person, Mr. Henry Kahn. Get you over here, Henry. Okay. Henry, thank you so much for joining us and your willingness to be our first person today. We're really honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Henry, before we begin our conversation today, you asked that we start by noting to our audience that there are a broad range of ways that people survive the Holocaust, depending on the time, place, and circumstances that they were living under. Some survived concentration camps. For example, you shared with me that your friend Jean...
I can't hear.
Is that better?
Yeah,
okay.
You know.
You shared with me that your friend Jean survived Auschwitz, but Jean's 8 family members did not. There are others who survived in hiding, and then others like you who were rescued and found safety in countries not occupied by the Nazi regime. And that's a way to remind us that your account of what you experienced is one individual account. And before we continue, I know you can't see this, but Henry brought this with us to put up front. And it says, "No wicked person will succeed if the good people don't accede." So we will accede. We will remind ourselves of that throughout with that right there. Henry, you have so much to tell us. We have a little time, so we're going to start. You were 10 years old when Hitler and the Nazis came to power in 1933. Before we turn to the war and the Holocaust and the early years of the Hitler regime, tell us about your family and you in the years before 1933.
Well, we lived in a relatively small town which in the meantime became a suburb of Stuttgart, but it was Böblingen at the time. It was a town, independent town, and my father eventually had to travel every morning by train to get to work. On the 18th of January, 1923, when I was born, my mother was in the hospital, and next to her, or close to her, was another lady who had a daughter. She was Mrs. Kindler. and she and my wife and my mother became very good friends, as did their respective families. Mr. Kindler was the owner of a toy factory, which accrued too much benefits to myself and my brother. My brother unfortunately passed away in 1932 at 7 years of age, but we were very friendly. My parents went skiing with him, played tennis, and my father and Mr. Kindler, they met on Sunday mornings in the guest house, and they were good friends. After the Nazis had come, Mr. Kindler didn't want to join the Nazi party, but my father suggested to them that it might be a good idea that he should join, because it would be an outcast if he didn't. Well, talking about outcasts, the Jews were very much outcasts, and Hitler did his best to eventually destroy the Jews. My father was of the opinion that he had been in the First World War. He earned the Iron Cross, and was a veteran, obviously, and that nothing could happen to him. However, after the 9th of November, the Kristallnacht, he was arrested and sent to the concentration camp. And when he came back, very haggard and no hair, all shaved off, he told me and my mother, if ever I get back there, I'll never come out alive. By then he had changed his opinion, and unfortunately it was too late.
Henry, before we continue on about Kristallnacht, let me ask you just another question. I think when you were about 7, in 1930, your family moved to Stuttgart so you could attend the original Waldorf school. Tell us about that.
I was getting to that.
Okay.
When I was 7 years old, my father, who had to commute every morning after he had been elected president of the association, we decided, or the parents decided, to move to Stuttgart. And we moved very close to the Waldorf school. The Waldorf school was a unique school, and the owner of a cigarette factory, which was called Waldorf Astoria Cigarette Factory, he was the one who requested a philosopher from Austria, Rudolf Steiner, to guide the school. And his philosophy was very modern even today. In the meantime, the school was founded. They were very unique. And in the meantime, the schools, branches of the school exist all over the world, including over here. My father, so I went to that Waldorf school. This philosophy, of course, did not agree with the Nazis, or rather the Nazis didn't agree with the Waldorf school philosophy. And consequently, in 1938, the school was closed and the teachers were dismissed, and they had to look for jobs. I had a class teacher who was teaching the class from the 1st to the 5th grade. I was there until the 4th grade when we moved to Cologne. Well, as I mentioned in the literature which you got, in 1938, when after the Kristallnacht, we received a telegram from my cousin in England, who was working in a plywood factory. And he was friendly with a girl whose father was the owner, or part owner, of a clothing factory, London Brothers. And he persuaded them to sponsor me, because kids who came to England with the Kindertransport they had to be sponsored by somebody. And thus I was very fortunate that I was able to get to England with the Kindertransport.
Henry, may I go back and before we talk about the Kindertransport and ask you just a couple more questions before we get there? Shortly after Hitler came to power in 1933, I think your father lost his business. Tell us about his losing his business and how he made ends meet for his family.
Well, unfortunately, that was very simple. After 33, after Hitler came to power, there were the organization where my father was the president of was pretty large, and of course there were Nazis amongst the members. And one day, one of the Nazis in his uniform came into the office and told my father he should get out. He has no right to be there anymore. My father threw the keys on the floor and walked out, and that was it. So there was no argument. He couldn't call the police or anything like this because the Nazis were in power, and they had a lot of power because he couldn't argue with them. The police was their headmate, more or less, because they couldn't do anything either.
Henry, did you...
Anyway, getting back to 1939...
One more question. Before 1938, did your family consider emigrating? Did they think about leaving Germany?
Well, unfortunately, my mother certainly did. She did all sorts of things to prepare for immigration. However, my father, he was so convinced that nothing could happen to him, and he didn't change his mind until he came back from the concentration camp. So consequently, and at that time, women didn't have as much power as they have these days, and consequently, there was no question. So we moved to Cologne, where my father took over a plywood dealership, and he worked there, and it was, I don't know how successful or unsuccessful it was, but he was working in there until 1938.
And as you told us already, your father was arrested as part of Kristallnacht.
As I said, yes, I told you. When he came out from the concentration camp, then he had changed his mind, but then it was too late. But 18 days after my 16th birthday, my parents and I went to the railroad station, and they said goodbye to me because I was supposed to go with the Kindertransport to England. Well, I got into the car, and I knew I was going to see them again. I mean, I just knew it. I can't tell you how, but however, the train was delayed by half an hour, and my parents, who had left the platform, found out about it and came back. The moment I saw them coming back, I knew this is the last time I see them and the last time I talk to them. And this is exactly how it worked out. You can imagine my condition when I noticed that. It was a feeling. I can't explain it to you, but this is the way it was. Well, when we crossed the border, after we had crossed the border into Holland, the train left, and after we crossed the border into Holland, a girl, and I was one of the oldest ones because the age limit for people for the Kindertransport was from 3 to 17. I was 16, so I just made it. After we had crossed the border, and everybody was sure that the Nazis weren't there anymore, a little girl took a newspaper, an illustrated paper with Hitler's picture on it, and tore it into 1,000 pieces. So it gives you an idea of the atmosphere in the apartment when we had left that. Mm-hmm. Well, we finally got to England. Overnight, the ferry took us across the channel. And when we got into that big hall, everybody wore a little tag. And since I had learned a little English, excuse me. In the Waldorf school, we learned English, and we heard English from the first English and French from the first grade on. And boys and girls were, getting back to that, the boys and girls were in the same class, and in the third grade, everybody had a shop. We learned how to sew and crochet hook in the first grade, and girls were able to go into a workshop and learn how to use tools, just to give you an idea about the Waldorf school. So now we were in England, and there we were in a big hall, and people walked in and looked for children who had been assigned to them. And I knew a little bit of English, so a nice lady walked in a nice fur coat, and I figured I'd see whether I can help her, and I asked her whether I could help her. And she pulled out a paper and read off Henry Kahn. So I had my sponsor. Her name was Mrs. London, and my cousin came, and we drove to their home, which was in Hampstead Garden suburb, which was a nice home. After a very short time, Mr. London asked me whether I would like to go to school or whether I would like to work. Well, I had in mind to get to the United States, and I knew going to school wouldn't teach me very much to make a living. So I decided I wanted to get a job and learn how to, and what's more, I had no money anyway. So I decided I wanted to go to work, to learn something so I could earn a living when I get to the States, as well as to save up some money. Well, it took a couple of weeks before Mr. London could get the permit for me, and then every morning and every evening I was taken by car to work, which was wonderful, except it was a glorified prison, because Hampstead Garden suburb where they lived was very excluded. There was no public transportation within easy walking distance, and so I was stuck over there. As I said, it was a glorified prison. I had lunch with the staff in the factory, but I was assigned to go to the packing room. There I learned how to make knots and how to put tags on pants, but that wasn't much of a profession. So I asked Mr. London to let me work in the machine shop, learn how to sew, but that was inappropriate at the time for the protégé of the owner to work with those common girls. So he said no. He also gave me I got a salary of £1 with 30 shillings a week. Well, I told Mr. London, you don't have to give me that much money because after all, I live with you and there's no need for it. He said, well, that's okay. Well, I saved it. I couldn't spend it, which was okay. And, well, that went on for a while, and I couldn't get into the machine shop. However, this was the beginning of about April of '39, and as you know, the war broke out in September. The moment the war broke out, Mr. London told me that he and his family are going to evacuate, but since I'm working, I should go and look for a place to stay. Well, now I look for a place to stay, and then I asked him, I'd like to have more money, but he told me, you can't have any more. Now, it was a little difficult. Of course, I still had lunch at the factory, but I mean, that wasn't much good because I had to pay 14 shillings and sixpence, which is equivalent to $40 out of 20. And I had to pay that for breakfast and boarding and bed and breakfast, basically. I took my bicycle. I don't know where I got the bicycle from. I still can't remember how I got it, but I had a German bicycle with me. and every morning I drove to work.
Henry, I want to interrupt for a second. During this time, were you able to hear from your parents? Did you have contact with your parents?
No, I didn't.
No, okay.
No, not even during this time, because the war had already, well, I got a, no, I didn't get a direct letter anyway.
Okay.
So I tried to find somebody to sponsor my parents, but I wasn't successful. Anyway, I was brought up not to ask too many questions of people, to ask for favors, and that was a bad mistake. You should be more aggressive as far as your children are concerned. Well, nowadays they teach them that. And
So, Henry, September 1st, 1939.
September 1st, the war broke out, and almost immediately the sirens started blowing up, but it was a false alarm, fortunately. But now, since I lived by myself, as I said, I found a place in the north of London, which was more, not quite as exclusive as the southern suburb. And there, first of all, there was the county council school, within walking distance from where I lived. And I took advantage of this and took a course in bookkeeping, which had nothing to do with packing or sewing, but it came in handy eventually. There also was a synagogue, and I went there, and I had a friend who lived across the street from me. So I had a social life which was quite something in comparison to what I had in London Garden Suburb. I went to school, and now I asked Mr. London to let me work in the sewing machine room because he couldn't say no anymore, because now I was on my own, and he let me do it. Very shortly after I started, I was efficient enough at it so that I asked to go on piecework. Piecework is that you get paid for each piece which you produce. And that way I was able to make 30 shillings, which is 50% more than I would have gotten before. And that was very helpful.
Henry, I want to ask you about something. Right after the war began,
Pardon?
Right after the war began in September 1939, you were called before a tribunal, and a notation was put in your record that said, and I'm going to read this, "The holder of this certificate is to be exempted from further order from internment and from the special restrictions applicable to enemy aliens under the aliens order." And then later, in December, your record, what was added to it were the words, "You are a refugee from Nazi oppression." What did that mean?
Well, I'll tell you what happened.
Okay.
First, it was okay. I went to work every day, and I went to school at night, and I had a little social life, which was great. But then, in 1940, in May 1940, the Germans, in the meantime, the British had sent an expeditionary force to the continent, and in May 1940, the Nazis invaded Holland, Belgium, and the south of France, and the British expeditionary force was cut off and encircled in Dunkirk. 300,000 of the British soldiers and Free French and others were able to escape to England, but all the equipment was lost. As a result thereof, the Brits didn't only get scared, they got panicky. They panicked. And once they panicked, they decided to intern the lot. In other words, intern everybody who came from Germany, because they really didn't know what to do anymore. And being in panic, they did all sorts of stupid things, and that was one of them. And the people who really would have helped them, they shut up. Well, we were interned on the 3rd of July. On the 3rd of July, before I was interned, I noticed and I found out that several of my acquaintances were interned. So before I was interned, I took all the money which I had saved up and took it to the Bloomsbury House. The Bloomsbury House was the agency which was responsible for the Kindertransport, for the kids from the Kindertransport. And I gave them the money and said, get me out as fast as possible so that I can get to the United States and buy me a ticket. They said, well, the money isn't quite enough, but we'll make up the difference, which was great. I appreciated that, but things never work out the way you think.
Henry, just to make sure our audience understands, what you've told us is that even though England welcomed you on the Kindertransport, even though you were Jewish and a refugee from the Nazis, in their panic because you were German and from Germany, they forced you to be interned.
Yes, of course, that's what I said. They were panicked.
Right.
They panicked, that's all.
Right, okay. I just want to make sure everybody understood.
They didn't know what they were doing.
Okay. All right, so what'd they do to you? Okay.
Well, as I said, I took my money over there. On the 3rd of July, on the 2nd of July, when I came home, I was told that I have to report to the police, take all my stuff and go to the police station. I went there and was promptly interned. From the 3rd to the 4th, we were taken to a race course outside of London, and the next day we got a big piece of cheese, and that was our provision for the day. We were taken by train, all the internees were taken by train to Liverpool, which is on the west coast of England. It's a port, and there we were put into a camp, which looked like an army camp. It was tent camp. We were told that Liverpool had been bombed the week before, and the Arendora Star, which was a ship which had taken internees and prisoners of war to Canada, had been torpedoed and sunk, and many people drowned. So now we were asked, who wants to volunteer to be sent to an overseas dominion? I didn't know what the dominion was, but I figured it wouldn't be Canada, they could have said so. So I decided that I would take a chance with a torpedo rather than with bombs and machine guns, and God forbid if the Nazis take over, would be caught by the Nazis again. Excuse me. Well, on the 10th, we were taken aboard the ship, and all our luggage was piled on top of the top deck, and I was assigned to the bottom deck in the front of the ship. There were hooks on the ceiling, and I figured there was hammocks, and I made sure I got some. Eventually, I got a hammock, and I was sleeping there, which was good. Well, anyway, the very night, the ship left the pier, and the ship was pitching and rolling crazily, but there was no storm. But I didn't know that because I couldn't tell what the weather was like. As it turned out, they tried to avoid torpedoes. And sure enough, a torpedo hit the ship, made a dent, but did not explode. Now, 22 years later, that was 62 or 63, I, my wife, and my two sons met my former teacher from the Waldorf School. And he told us that after they were dismissed from the school, he had to find a job. And he told us, he worked in a torpedo factory, and once in a while, he sabotaged the torpedo by putting sand into the mechanism. And thus, for all I know, he was the one who saved my life, and a lot of others, getting back to the ship. It took us about a month, where we went around the Cape of Good Hope. It was a very slow ship, and we finally arrived in Sydney, Australia.
Henry, I know there's much more for you to tell us. Just a couple of things about that trip. Tell us a little bit about how you were treated, what the guards were like, and what happened to your personal belongings.
Well, that's a long story, but...
Do a short version if you can.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, the ship was a troop ship and was providing for 1,500 troops. Now, there were more than 2,500 people aboard now. So you can imagine how crowded it was. And many of the people had to sleep on the floor. They slept on the floor. They preferred it. They didn't know how to go into a hammock, which I happen to know. And, well, I was lucky. I got myself a hammock, and I slept very comfortably. They didn't have enough of anything. And so it was rather scarce. There were showers, yes, but there was seawater, and you couldn't do much with seawater as far as cleaning yourself is concerned. So the mess got pretty bad, and people brought up. I mean, people got seasick, so I decided I'd do something about it. I got myself a few young guys together like myself, and we asked for buckets and brooms, and we chased half the deck to the one side of the deck and cleaned up, and then we sent them back and cleaned the rest of it. Well, this activity gave us some benefits, which was very good, because instead of having to run around the deck every morning for half an hour or so, with machine guns pointing at us in either direction, there's the few of us who cleaned the deck. We were able to go on top of the deck and enjoy the fresh air, which was quite something. It was very valuable at the time, I can assure you. Well, anyway, after we got to...
Here's what I wanted you to tell me. You had, as you described in the beginning, you had put your luggage on the top.
Oh, yes, that's another story.
Yeah.
We had to put all our luggage on a big pile, and they put a big canvas over it. When I got on top of the deck to the travel, I noticed that the tap had been taken off the luggage, and the troops, which of course were not the cream of the crop as far as the British Army was concerned, they were one-eyed and limping and drunkards, and they helped themselves. They opened up the luggage and threw stuff overboard. Well, this was a criminal offense, of course, but nobody cared about that at the time. However, it accrued to our benefit, because another U-boat which had followed us, the captain was curious what they had thrown overboard, and he picked it up. And he noticed there were German letters. So he realized there were Germans aboard. And he didn't shoot the torpedoes. And it was one way when we were also saved, which was I found that out when I visited Germany after the war, especially Stuttgart.
Thank you for telling us that. Thank you for telling us that. Now you've made it to Australia after a very long trip. Now you're in Australia.
I know. It took us over a month. To get there. And we finally landed up in Sydney, Australia. We were taken off the ship, but while we were taking off the ship, taking aboard the train, took us 18 hours into the interior. We got there was Hay, which was a small village in the desert, basically. The sand was flowing, the wind was flowing, and the sand was hitting us like sandblasting. We got into that new camp, and we probably had something to eat and went to sleep. The Australian soldiers, they were very nice and very kind. There was no problem at all. And I tell you something else. While we were on the Donera, one of the soldiers, one of the cream of the crop of the British Army, they got so drunk that they dropped their rifle. One of the internees picked up the rifle and took him into the sick bay so that he could be rejuvenated. Anyway, getting back to Australia. We got into that camp, and the very next morning, out of 2,500 people, 13 names were called out. 13, as far as I'm concerned, is a very fortunate number. 13 names were called out. I was the first one on the list. And one of our 13 overheard the soldiers say, well, these chaps are going back to England. Well, we weren't asked, and we didn't know what was going on. Anyway, the 13 of us were taken back to the ship, but there was no room, so we were taken into the bunker. We were locked up, and that's the first time that I really got scared, because I was locked up and I knew if the ship there was no chance for me surviving at all. However, then we got something to eat, and that made me feel better. After a while, we were taken out. They had to find some place to put us, so they took us up to Malabar Hill in Sydney. If there's anybody here from Sydney, then they know where Malabar Hill is. There's a prison up there, and one section of the prison had been cordoned off with barbed wire, and that was an internment camp. And there was an Italian internee who got the paper every morning. And in it we saw that East London, where I used to work, was up in flames. And we were supposed to get back there. You can imagine how I felt about that. Well, we were in that internment camp on Malabar Hill. And after 10 days in Australia, we were taken back to the ship. The ship lifted anchor, and lo and behold, we lifted anchor and we took off. Well, it took us over a month to get to Sydney, but after 2 weeks, the ship stopped, and the 13 of us were taken off. The first thing I noticed was that there were all dark-skinned people and red spots on the floor. And eventually I got an explanation for all of it. So we were taken to the police station, and all 13 of us were interviewed by individuals. And the officer who interviewed me asked me all sorts of silly questions. And then he said to me, "Where do you live?" I said, "Well, I don't even know where I am, and you asked me where I live." So he had to find out. So he came back and he told me, "You live in the Jewish Relief Association home in Baikala, Bombay, India." So that's the first thing that's the first time I found out where I was. So I was in India. Well, like police car, we were taken over there to Baikala, to the Jewish Relief Association home, and there, we were told we have to report twice a week to the police station, otherwise we could walk around and do what we wanted. I was not interned anymore. I was free to move around in Bombay. I couldn't leave the island of Bombay without permission, but that was it. So voila, I was free.
Why did they leave you in Bombay when you were supposed to go back to England?
Well, I wasn't supposed to. The guy didn't know.
Okay, but why did they leave you in
He assumed it.
Okay.
And the reason we were taken off was because, as I mentioned before, it was a troop ship which was able to carry 1,500 troops. And the ship was scheduled to take on British Indian troops to take to the Middle East to fight. So I was with the other 12 in Bombay, and the troop ship took to the soldiers to the Middle East.
And you would stay in India for the duration of the war. You stayed in India for the rest of the war.
Well, I'll tell you about that.
Okay.
So now, I could have asked to be sent back to Britain, but I had no taste for that. There was no reason for me to go back to England. I wanted to get to the United States eventually, which eventually I did, but it took quite a few years before that. Anyway, I was in Bombay now, and I wanted to learn something that would help. A gentleman from the Jewish Relief Association took interest in the 13 of us. He invited 6 of us at one time and 7 of us, the other 7 at another time. And we had a big meal at his house. He had a beautiful home, and I became friendly with him, and I asked him to see whether I could get a job learning something. Well, he knew somebody in the dental mechanic business, and he asked him. Well, I would work there for a while, but the owner wouldn't allow me to do anything at all. And the assistant, he showed me a few things, but basically I couldn't learn anything, and I didn't get any money to speak of. I didn't even get enough money to pay for the fare, so that was no good. So I told him, you have to give me more money, or you have to teach me something, or I can't afford to work for you anymore. So I turned things around, him affording me or I affording him. So now, since I had some knowledge in bookkeeping, as I told you, I had a chance to go to work as a bookkeeper in a small office of a Austrian gentleman who had a consulting engineer's office. I mean, he was a consulting engineer, quote unquote, and he was also trying to sell some stuff. So I worked for him, and I got there 35 rupees, which was certainly an improvement over 10, which I got from the lab. But it wasn't really enough to get out of the home. I wanted to get out of there. Well, I bought myself a little book on bookkeeping for 12 annas and 12 annas. And I quickly read it, and lo and behold, I was a bookkeeper. So now, I worked for him for a while. Then an opening came at the Indian Tool Company. Indian Tool Company was owned at the time by a Czech gentleman, and he offered me a job to supervise the night shift. Well, I was 17 years old, or 18 years old by then, and I was supposed to supervise the night shift. Well, the qualification I had was, you understand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I went there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon after the people left, the workers left. I waited until about 8 when the night shift started. There were a few people, but about 10 of them. They worked on the lathe. This was a tool company. They made twist tools. There was bits for making holes. They were small, from an eighth of an inch to 2 inches. And they were machined and hardened, and it was interesting.
Henry, I'm going to jump in for just a minute. There's some things I still want you to tell us about in the remaining time. One of them is, tell us about the friend of yours from Germany who wrote a letter to your parents. You had a friend, Eric.
Well, that's much later, you know.
I thought he wrote it.
Well, no, it's not much later. That's not true.
Right.
While I had been in Madras and had come back from Madras, and a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, whom I had met in a kinderheim in Germany already, and I was in constant touch with him. I met him in England also. He had gotten to the United States. He was in the United States Army. He was assigned to the Transportation Corps, and he came to New York, to Bombay, and he met somebody who knew that I had come back from Madras. And he called me up, and I met him for 3 days. And well, that's not right. I mean, it's a little different. So I met him, and he took me to the PX, which was very impressive. And on the second day, he found out that his mother had passed away in New York. And on the third day, he left. So, and I didn't see him again until I got back, until I got to the United States in '46. But after I got to Bombay, a gentleman left for America, and I asked him to see that friend of mine who lived in New York, the same guy, and when he immediately wrote to my parents to say that I am safe in India, and my parents were extremely grateful. They wrote a very nice letter to my friend, who in turn gave it to me eventually, and to thank him. And because they didn't know what had happened to me, because there was no news at all.
And was that the last letter you ever had from your parents?
And that was the last letter I ever got from my parents.
In the time we have left, Henry, tell us about Doreen. Tell us about...
Well, after I had come back from Madras, I was there for about 3/4 of a year. A friend of mine in the Army, he took me to the Maccabi Sports Club. The Maccabi Sports Club, they played ping pong over there and stuff like that. And there was a girl who played ping pong, and I thought I could play ping pong, but she beat me most of the time. So I had to get even with her. What do you think I did? I married her. Well, but that wasn't right away, because when I got to the United States in '46, I prepared for that also. But anyway, 7 months after I got to the United States, I was drafted in the Army. And while I was in the Army, I went to the State Department and spoke to somebody over there and asked them, whether they could do anything for my sweetheart. I had a conditional engagement with her. In other words, if and when we meet again, then we get and feel the same way about each other as we do now, we get married. Well, we got married for 64 years until she passed away in 2012. And well, they didn't do much, but they told me that something could be done. I was in the Army. I knew there are 3 ways of doing things: the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. And the Army way always works one way. So her name was Doreen. She worked across the street from American Embassy, and one day she got a call and asked whether she still wanted to get to the United States. She said yes. The next day she got another call, and she was told, when do you want to go? as simple as all that. Well, after 2.5 years and 113 letters that we exchanged, both of us did, she finally arrived in New York, and she arrived on the 9th of June, 1948, and on the 27th we became husband and wife. Voila.
Henry, if you're okay with this, I want to read something that Doreen wrote that you shared with me. Henry shared with me that Doreen wrote in her journal on New Year's Day, 1946, danced, this is while they were still in India, danced every dance with Henry, and so ends 1945 with no regrets, the most interesting year I've ever experienced. Just what a love story. So, last thing I have to ask you about, Henry, before we close the program. When did you learn about what happened to your parents?
About what?
When did you learn about what happened to your parents?
Well, while my wife was alive, I didn't do anything with the Holocaust Museum because she had no interest in that. We did everything together. I was a member with her of the thrift shop of the National Council of Jewish Women. However, after she passed away, I decided I'll work in the Holocaust Museum, which I did. And there I found out that my parents had been sent in 41 to Lodz, to the concentration camp over there. My father eventually died in 43, I believe, and my mother survived until 44. And apparently, she was on a forced march to be sent back to Germany. However, the Nazis, they let them go until the border of Germany in Poland. They were forced to dig their own graves, and then they were machine gunned. So that's the story of my mother. So not everybody was as lucky as I was. In fact, the majority of people were less fortunate than I was. And I was an exceptional exception, I would say. I didn't hear a single shot being in earnest during the whole war.
Henry, I'm going to turn back to Henry in just a minute. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So Henry will close our program. We didn't, as you could tell, we could have spent the rest of the afternoon. There were so many details and other stories that Henry could have told us, so we don't get to hear those, and not an opportunity for you to ask him questions from the audience. But Henry's going to stay up here when he finishes, and we invite anybody who would like to come up on stage to come up and meet Henry, shake his hand, get your picture taken with him, or ask him a question if you have one, if that's okay with you, Henry.
Okay, sure.
So before I turn back to Henry, let me just thank you all for being here. Remind you we'll have a first-person program each and every Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August, and we hope you can join us again this year, or if not, in 2017. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Henry to close today's program.
If you know somebody whom you hate, and you really have a very good reason to hate him, remember, do not generalize and do not assume that everybody in the same category, everybody with the same background is the same. Be discriminatory and be judicious and make sure that you don't prejudice what you think about the other people. You're justified in hating that one person, but do not ever generalize. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you.